history book, the 1940 flood was called the Great Flood by anybody that survived it. And last year, Jimmy Decker, well, the Decker family donated a document that Frances E. Decker had written from 1940. And she put down her memories of the flood essentially 3 days or 4 days after the flood had happened. And I read this over the winter and I thought, wow, this story should be told to everybody that moves to Pemberton. It's quite the story. So that's what I have for you here today. Flooding's always been a problem in Pemberton, some years more than others. And you know, by 1940, some farmers had put in dikes. Although these dikes weren't really that adequate, they'd sort of help keep the river within its banks. And there was early cool weather in September 1940. The mountaintops were white with snow. October, the start of October, was a beautiful month. It was a really bountiful harvest. Everyone was harvesting their crops, putting their crops away for the winter. And then a warm rain began to fall on Tuesday, October 15th. And 5 inches fell in 24 hours at the peak of the rainfall.
It's my birthday.
So, this is the 1940 flood is remembered by Frances E. Decker. Dear children, she writes, this will be your story of the Pemberton flood. It will be such a long story that I could not possibly find time just now to send all the details to each of you in letters. We are all hoping at home that you will not be worried by the first radio or newspaper reports that go out. We have listened carefully, but apparently there's been no news out of Pemberton as of yet. We are all well. Coopers, Rosses, Kays, Fowlers, Girlings, and Ronans. That's all we know as yet. For the last 2 weeks, the weather's been pretty good, though unsettled. And the weather broke when we were half done the potato field by the house. Tuesday, it rained all day, sacking or any field work impossible. Wednesday was the same. Thursday night, it poured with rain, a warm rain. And Bish went to the river and reported that the snags in front of our place were still uncovered, so the river was still low for some time. We thought the heavy warm rain dangerous, but on hearing how low the river was, we decided that we didn't need to have any anxiety about floods and instead turned our attention to getting the mail. Friday morning, wakened early. It was still raining very heavily. Mild, and the river was very high. Dirty, yellow flood water. Rainwater standing everywhere. There was a great deal of mist about. Watching, I realized the cause was the warm rain meeting the icy river water. I noticed later that a great deal of mist settled around Gerald Ross's place, behind Kay's, and on the back of Cooper's field. Decided that as soon as lunch was over, I would go and see if the mist at the back was caused by flood water. Bryan Creek had sure been making a lot of noise. So Rosemary and I went back and found no sign of water anywhere until we came out from the field peat patch to the old trail along the little creek. Water was there and a small trickle going along the trail toward Ronan's, and a real stream about 10 inches deep going along the trail toward Cooper's. We did not venture further ahead but stood a while peering at the creek through the trees. It was a terrible sight. Dirty gray water jumping up and over the logs, much higher than the ground where we were standing. We backtracked across Cooper's turnip patch. Arrived back at the house, made afternoon tea, and reported what we had seen. Jack Taylorford had gone up about 11 a.m. with a big truck and a rowboat in the back. We know now he was only able to go as far as Ross's place and turn back. Too much water. Sandy Fowler went back down. We were expecting our groceries. Rosemary and I continued our explorations to the road and the mailbox. We met Jim at the gate. He'd been patrolling the road since school was dismissed at 2:30, and he was reporting to Jack Ronan. He was only able to go as far as Sandy Ross's up the valley and Johnston's down the valley. The river was just at the top of the dike, as far as I could see up and down. Jim begged me to go to the corner to see the grade. He wanted to go back and tell Jack Ronan what we'd just seen at the creek. We walked down. At the grade, the river was boss, a regular cascade coming over on 3 long spillways. Noticed on the way that the trickle had widened to 12 inches or more. We met Johnny, Eddie, and Cliff Ronan with shovels. Dad had just finished his tea, so we told him about the water. and asked if Bish couldn't take the team out for the wagon. Dad had forgotten all about the wagon that was now standing in floodwater and sent Bish to harness the team. He went to Cooper's to see how things were going, and from then on things happened far more quickly than I can put them down. Just as we'd come in from the creek, the Coopers had turned their cows into the field by their garden. Mrs. Cooper came, and I was watching Dad tearing by on the saddle horse and called out that she was getting the cows in. Jim had come by Cooper's gate as our lane was muddy, and I saw Dad run to him, and they both ran back to Cooper's barn. "The jam at the mouth of the canal has gone out," Jim yelled. "Dad is helping Cooper's. You're to help Bish get the wagon." We ran back to the barn to help Bish. By this time, our pasture was full of water. The cows had no land left to stand on and were bawling every time I passed them. This all happened between 3:30 and dusk. Remember, this was only rainwater in Cooper's place until the jam at the canal broke, and then it was almost unbelievable, the rapidity with which the water rose and filled everything. When we were loading the first wagon that I drove in, there was water coming over the dike in about half a dozen places. In half an hour, it was spilling over everywhere. Went down for cows. They crowded around me, bawling. Turned cows and 2 other calves out with the horses. When Cooper was finished, the water was waist deep and up our lane as far as the willow tree. We tried to persuade the Coopers to come over for the night, but they preferred to stay home. The rain kept coming down. We did not finish supper till late. We took stock of wood and clean water, oil, and decided we could not go to bed. We went out frequently to watch the water, which was coming up higher all the time. Dad and Jim went out behind the barn and found plenty of Ryan Creek water. Dad, Jim, Bish worked until 11:30 sacking up the seed that was on the barn floor. All afternoon the family had been hearing the thumps and thuds from the creek, presumably. We decided then that the jam at Ryan Creek must have gone. Eventually we went to bed, but not to sleep. Cooper's house was surrounded. The water came up to our fence in front of the house and spread up over the field beside the house. There was a stream running down Cooper's garden. Just before dark, we could see water all over the Kay's place. When we got up Saturday morning, the water was still rising, and such a sight met our eyes. Lillooet River and Ryan Creek, a rushing stream between Cooper's barn and the road, between barn and house, and between us and all Cooper's buildings. That's where the strong currents were, and another current down Cooper's pasture fence from the back, following the line of his ditches and that old creek bed. Cows bawling near and far, all manners of sticks and rubbish collected against the fences, all manner of stuff going down across our fields, blasting herd above and below us, water as far as we could see down through Ronan's. The men milked our cows and Cooper's, and we hurried breakfast, hoping to get Cooper's across and give them a good meal. Had watched in vain for smoke from their chimney. No smoke to be seen from any house. The heavy mist kept shifting about all the time. Could not see any distance. Dad and Bish made a raft as quickly as possible, and after several attempts, Bish got across the far side of Cooper's field to the kitchen door. Mrs. Cooper came when he called, and the water downstairs was up to her knees. They were all right, living upstairs, and would not leave the house then, as they wanted to move all their belongings up away from the water. Caves in the attic of their cellar. The water kept on rising. We gathered beets and cabbage from the garden for lunch. Ryan Creek water running down everywhere in my garden. I washed the beets in Ryan Creek and took the cabbage down under the north dining room window and washed it in the Lillooet River. The water was half up to Cooper's windows. We felt very sorry for the calves and pig in the barn. The new cellar door at Cooper's was half covered with water. Our chicken yard and calf pasture was full of water. In the afternoon, we could see Cooper's at the upstairs window, and we felt badly because we didn't have any way of getting across to them through that awful current. We didn't know how much longer it would last. The water was still rising. Dad and Bish went back to the creek in the afternoon and ran into Gerald Ross. He was looking to see what had happened also. They found the old jam had broken all away, but so much debris had come down with the flood that Ryan Creek is locked up tight, as Gerald said, for 100 years. The creek had dropped 8 feet since Friday night, and he thought we should see the water dropping here. The water began to drop in the late afternoon. We could hardly believe it at first, but in an hour or so it was plainly seen that water was receding from the house. There was no sign of life anywhere all day except at Cooper's window and Kay's. No smoke. Went to bed early and much happier. The water really was going down. Just before bedtime, I went out the front door and walked all around the lawn without finding water anywhere. This morning we were all up early. The water had gone off our potato patch. Water all gone from Cooper's field. Finally saw Mr. Cooper when he made his first appearance. Then he came over to tell of his experiences, how they'd wondered how we could reach them if it got worse. They'd spent Friday night and Saturday morning moving all belongings upstairs. The bars on the bedsteads that hold the springs were wet when they got around to moving them, but they didn't lose a thing in the house. Cooper nailed boards over the woodshed door. I ran over to see if they would come over for a hot breakfast, and such a mess. The floor had a couple of inches of wet silt all over, and the watermark on the wall close to 2 feet high. However, neither Mrs. Cooper or him wanted to leave until they'd cleaned up the house. But they were all out of bread and fresh milk, so the children rushed over with plenty for them and hot porridge. They had coffee on already, though. I forgot to tell you that Gerald and Edwina Ross had been rescued from their home on Saturday morning. Billy Fowler went across with a boat and took them to Sandy's. The water was up to the tabletop. They lost all their firewood, all their chickens, coal oil, and bicycle. Sandy Ross came down this morning. Cooper and Dad saw him at the road. Cooper got over near enough to talk to him. The government truck is lying on one side. They blew the dike around the government shed. Billy Fowler had come across Saturday morning to rescue their horses and get them to high ground. Eventually he got them to B. Girlings. Girlings were then prisoners in their houses, cows belly deep in the barn. Going back across the river, Billy and Sandy collided with a cottonwood log and stove in one side of the canoe. They pulled it up on top of Fowler's chicken house to mend it, and then the chicken house began to move. Sandy went down to Ronan's and coming back called over to Cooper's that there'd been water in E. Ronan's house, 4 feet at Blakeway's and 2 feet in Joe Ronan's. No water in Sandy's house, but pretty close. Water running in from the river through several holes in the dike bridge at Gerald's was gone. The bridge at Fowler's was gone. The grade between here and the Ronans badly washed out. The bridge at Jack's still there, but very shaky. Ronans blew their dam. Jack Ronan had 2.5 feet of water in the house, but he saved his bees. Robbie Miller walked up the road and Bish called to ask him what damage they'd had down there. Robbie said they lost 11 head and all their bees. After lunch, Bish went for a walk across to Ronan's. Impossible to get there by the road. There must be several bad breaks above here. We can see there's only a narrow ledge of a path formed by the top of the dike. The rest is all water, and where the breaks are, we watch Sandy pick his way very carefully. No one wants to venture out just yet. Dad and Jim went back to see what had happened behind the barn and in the back fields. Dad says he was lucky to lose so little. There are potatoes lying all over the place, he says. 5 pits of Green Mountain gone and other varieties. Cooper hasn't a sign left of the potato pits he had at the back, and he had 5 tons of turnips ready to sack. They're all gone. All our topsoil is washed away, and a layer of silt and fine gravel all over the place. Dad says he has a new ranch. Monday. Cooper's helping us with his team. We've been all day salvaging the potato pits. The covering was stripped down from several, and there's always the danger of frost. It has been a very dirty job. We're all mired down in the mud and silt. The potatoes are filthy and the water cold. Blattler came up the road today. Johnson was badly flooded. Blattler tells us Johnson sat reading on Friday night. First his feet got wet, so we put them up on a box. Then the seat of the chair got wet, so he put a box on the chair. Sat on that, putting his feet on the stove. Then the water got so high, the box was wet, so he tore off an inside door and was making himself comfortable on his door raft when he remembered his cows were all tied up in the barn, so he rushed out to save them. And he was so alarmed that he waded up to Blattler's with the cows through water up to his armpits. Blattler said he was nearly all in when he reached their place. Ridley lost 7 head of cattle. You could not begin to imagine the terrible mess the flood has left. The pasture is like a big sandbar. Dad says it reminds him of mud flats, and that's just what it looks like. Our lane is blocked with debris. I've not been out, but Bish says there's a bad hole in it where the current gouged it out. The mailbox went early. The fences on the road are all down, and on the lane part way, and both Cooper's and our gates are gone. Got word of Fraser's, they say they're all right down there, but plenty of water. No details of losses of yet. Report has it that Dick Green went up to rescue Mr. Hartzell and Carl Abraham refused to be rescued. Why, this is nothing, he's credited with saying. We are wondering if his pigs can climb trees. Tuesday, I'm afraid I cannot begin to tell you how the back of the ranch is torn up. All the land that we thought high and dry was swept and gouged by that raging torrent from Ryan Creek. There could not have been 1 foot of dry land anywhere back there. There are sandbars, gravel bars 2.5 feet high, and there are holes dug out down to hardpan and below hardpan 1 and 2 feet. The ground is very soft. In some places it's impossible to walk over it. The sand seems bottomless. Fowler got up the valley today, and we gleaned a little more information. All Groat's Bend has been washed out. It will be 3 weeks at least before the road can be used again. Fowler said we had it much worse up the valley. Ryan broke loose first, and when Ryan Creek went down, the river began to rise and broke all our dikes up here. Had our dikes held, the lower valley would have been washed out. The PGE had a locomotive parked on the railroad bridge to hold it down, and it held. Wednesday, we worked at the potato pits all day. Jim and Rosemary still at home helping, only the Fowlers and Lexi at school. Bert Lundgren is making a footbridge out of a big cottonwood that was uprooted by the flood and fell across the creek at Gerald's. When it's leveled, the girling children may get down to school. There's absolutely no traffic on the road. The valley's at home collecting what is left of a bountiful harvest, the largest crop in years. Thursday, Cooper came again today to help us. The old cellar is filling fast now. Mrs. Fowler came over today. She was alone all Saturday and Sunday night. She forgot to take food when they went upstairs, so they were without food except for 1 loaf of bread and half a jug of milk. Tommy had held a pig up in the water for a long time to keep it from drowning. He held it by the ears and got so chilled he was sick after. Miller's lost all their pigs, 9 I think.
Oh.
Happy Shire and family were marooned on a bed. Henry Erickson cut a hole in the ceiling and they crawled up into the attic. Green's had 1.5 feet of water in the house. Fraser's the same. McCullough's went to the barn. We've all been very anxious about people living above the Girlings, so tonight Jim and Bish took a lantern and waited up. The Girlings had not lost anything at all. They only had the river flood, which was highest on Saturday. However, there's a break 30 feet long and deep as the bottom of the river, they say, in the grade, and it will not stop running until the river goes down to freezing level, if it even stops then. In the meantime, there can be no traffic at all above their place. In order to walk up the road, a detour must be made away back in their field, which means tough luck for all above there who have produce for market. Since when the river began to rise, the water reached the back windows of the car in Wilson's shed. John Jacks was nearly drowned but managed to get to Wilson's. No word of Landsborough. Lukey made a raft on the spur of the moment and evacuated himself and Mrs. Ball down to Wilson's. The raft struck a snag and capsized, but Lukey did the heroic, saved the gal's life, dragged her back on the raft and to the safety of Ed's. Old Dunk Morrison had to take to the rafters. Fisher took up his valuables and got to his barn where he was marooned for 3 days without food. In the excitement, he hadn't thought of eating. Guess he hardly expected to live long enough to need another meal. The barn was very shaky. It is a flimsy erection of poles and shakes. He said it creaked and groaned continually, and he expected to be tossed into the flood at any moment during the 3 days. The current in this flood was terrible. They have had floods here in plenty before, but nothing that ripped and tore along the way this one did. Once in the current, a raft was helpless. I do not think a good rowboat would have been manageable, and certainly not a canoe. What a flood. Written by Francis Decker. So I wanted to then look up a little bit of information about the 1940 flood. You know, and it was called the Great Flood. There's a chapter in a history book called The Great Flood, and it's all of these stories that residents had. And that disaster became a catalyst for the diking and drainage project that then began in 1946. The 1940 flood saw very little publicity or government assistance to settlers who lost livestock, crops, and machinery, and this resulted in some settlers leaving Pemberton forever. The only government help provided was seed for next year's planting. and that wasn't enough for people that suffered tremendous losses. After much lobbying, 1946 saw the formation of the Pemberton Drainage and Reclamation Committee by members from the Board of Trade and the Farmers Institute. They received government funding via the Prairie Farm Rehabilitation Act, which ironically was formed to deal with drought conditions on the prairies. Here it was the beginning of the diking and draining of the valley and making alterations to the channel between Lillooet Lake and Tenace Lake. And this brought large blocks of former swampland into production, enticing new settlers. Thanks to the efforts of these pioneers, Pemberton has survived many major high water events since 1940, including 1984, 1991, and most recently 2003. The cubic meter per second discharge of the 1940 event was 1,000 cubic meters per second. 2003 was 1,400 plus meters per second. And this is how they calculate discharge through the Lillooet River drainage system. And though some areas saw flooding, particularly Mount Currie in 2003, losses were not nearly comparable to the 1940 event, thanks to the diking and drainage infrastructure installed by Pemberton's pioneers.